the different countries and the different time zones. It's applicable to where you are, but thank you so much for joining us for this Africa's webinar on COVID-19, leading through communications and the role of media. This has been a very topical subject, so much so some institutions have already started to put up training courses on how to report on COVID-19 in terms of media. So communications in this space, quite important, and can't wait. And because we've already had some time wastage, I'm not going to waste any more time, but just bring on board and welcome the Director General of the Government Communications and Information Systems in South Africa, Director General Williams. Please lead us as we start the program.
Thank you very much, Program Director. To the members of the panel and to the distinguished guests who have made time to join us, good afternoon, Molweni, Jambo, and Bonjour. I hope I got those ones right. This is Africa. I have to get those names right. It is my great pleasure to address you today as we collectively seek ways to build a peaceful and a progressive continent. Engagements such as these enable us to exchange best practices which help us to sharpen our interaction with our citizens. Early this year, the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 as a global pandemic. Africa has not been spared the devastating impact of this pandemic. Health experts have already advised that to date, there is no vaccine or cure for COVID-19. President Cyril Ramaphosa, in his opening remarks as the chair of the AU, made the following remarks in the Conference of Africa's Leadership Role on COVID-19 Vaccine Development and Access. She stated that Africa has to be innovative in addressing our resource constraints through the establishment of the AU COVID-19 Response Fund, the Africa Medical Suppliers Platform, and the partnership to accelerate COVID-19 testing for the continent. She further stated that Africa should be planning and collaborating in its approach to the development and the effective distribution of the vaccine when it is found. This also challenges us to improve our communication infrastructure within the continent and improve our collaborative endeavors in the fight against health epidemics in the continent. South Africa responded at its first COVID-19 case on the 5th of March. The infected man and his wife had traveled to Italy on holiday. 2 weeks later, the country reported about 61 cases. It is also reported that 2 weeks later, we also had our first death as a result of COVID-19. To date, South Africa is leading the continent with over 600,000 cases and sadly over 12,000 deaths as a result of COVID-19. Today's topic is on the importance of leading communication as opposed to the crisis management during this period of COVID-19. After the World Health Organization had declared this pandemic, various countries adopted different responses to deal with it. South Africa also sprang into action and embarked on a comprehensive communication campaign to inform the nation about the measures to curb the spread of the virus. Among other things, basic information encouraging people in South Africa to wear a mask when in public, keeping a safe social distancing and regularly washing their hands with soap or use of an alcohol-based sanitizer was made available in all the 11 languages in South Africa. It should also be noted that many health experts agree that government had proactively flattened the curve and drastically reduced the spread of the virus by declaring the national state of disaster that resulted in a national lockdown. However, we should point out that some people felt that the government had overreacted in its response. Ladies and gentlemen, communication remains the most powerful instrument for the public interaction and engagement. In March 2020, President Cyril Ramaphosa stepped in to lead government's concerted effort to manage and reduce the clearly increasing COVID-19 cases in South Africa. In his first address to the nation, the president announced the formation of the National Corona Command Council, which is a structure that he was to chair as he coordinated the response of the country in dealing with the COVID-19. One of the work streams that was reporting on a weekly basis through this council was the communication and the mobilization. Prior to the setting up of the structure, we should point out that the communication was solely led by the Department of Health. As the infection numbers were continually increasing, fear and panic started creeping in communities across the country, especially in the Western Cape, which was the first province to experience a peak in a number of infections and deaths. Transparency and constant communication became key tools to empower communities in understanding the virus and how to protect themselves against it. All the government communication structures were pulled together to be led at the central level under the leadership of the GCIS. A communication strategy on COVID-19 was adopted, and it served as a guiding document in the development and dissemination of COVID-19 related messages. We should also point out that the Department of Health played an important role in signing off the content which was to be used in the communication. Our key principles were to keep our messages clear, concise, consistent, and all striving to effect the behavioral change to our citizens. The platforms we are using were informed by the outcomes of our research in respect of the preferences that were to be used by the various stratas of our society. It is important to highlight that South Africa remains a developmental country, still facing various levels of inequality. These obviously presented challenges in how we effectively exploit the less expensive and effective media, such as in the technology. For instance, we still had to explore conventional ways of interacting with communities in densely populated areas with less media coverage. To maximize the coverage and the impact of our communication, we first had to acquire a better understanding and appreciation of our target audience, including their communication needs and preferences. We had to invest in research that assists us to package our content for the different segments of our population. Our research also assisted us to obtain feedback on the impact of our messaging, and also assisted us to identify the glaring gaps in how we interact with our communities. Our communication intervention was in 4 fronts. We had to depend a lot of the media on the media, which I think one has to emphasize that media in this country went beyond the call in making sure that the information educating of South African is achieved. We also invested in a paid-for advertisement, which was both in the broadcasting print media. We also invested in the face-to-face engagements And also we invested in the digital media platforms. To date, the last research report that we received was that over 90% of South Africans know and understand the basic health protocols that needs to be adhered to. However, we are also very much aware what research tells us that we still have some challenges in how the South Africans behave in terms of observing the protocol, health protocol as provided. We have also amplified our interventions by building considerable number of partnerships with the private sector, with community-based organizations and the faith-based organizations. We have provided them with the information packages which they've used in their various platforms. We have also invested in working with the community-based media to reach the communities across the country. In the midst of our successes that we have achieved so far, I would also like to mention some of the curveballs that we have had to contend with during this period. When President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the national state of disaster in March 2020, our economy was on a slow growth trajectory. The Statistician General had reported that the South African economy recorded its third consecutive quarter of economic decline, falling by 2% in the first quarter of 2020. This followed a contraction of -1.4 and 0.8 in the fourth quarter of 2019, respectively. Unemployment increased from 29.1% to 30.1%, and we should indicate that the majority of the people who are unemployed at the moment are young people. The long lockdown restrictions further worsened the economic hardships faced by a number of South Africans. To mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 on the economy, the government announced a 500 billion package, a social relief package and economic support to the struggling businesses and also to the poor people. Apart from the economic decline, we have also noted a lot of hardships from families who lost their jobs, and also some of them who have sadly lost their loved ones during this period as a result of the COVID-19. Unfortunately, the good work done by government was to a certain extent spoiled by reports of acts of corruption involving unscrupulous companies and individuals. We remain encouraged by the freedom of the press in our country, which has contributed greatly in exposing some of these acts of corruption. Government respects and acknowledges the role the media that plays in safeguarding our democracy. We are also encouraged by the swift intervention by the law enforcement agencies to deal decisively with corruption. Chairperson, as I conclude, it is my view that our government responded swiftly to deal accordingly with COVID-19 by imposing the national lockdown. I strongly believe that this intervention assisted in strengthening our state of readiness as we subsequently started experiencing a decrease in the rate of infections. This has resulted recently in further reopening of the economy to level 2 of the risk-adjusted strategy. Level 2 further reopens our economy and relaxes restrictions on the movement of people, particularly interprovincial traveling. Once again, government played a central role in informing the public about the revised regulations through different platforms and in all the official languages. Lastly, when the president was addressing in the last address to the nation, he reminded us by using the quote from the former President Nelson Mandela that as we move to level 2, everything will depend in our hands and us taking responsibility as the citizens, as we know that COVID-19 is not yet gone. We've just reduced the number of infections, but it is still with us. I thank you Bye, Danki. Asante san.
Thank you so much, Director General Phumla Williams, for setting the tone for us. It really has been a difficult time of loss, but also a time of learning for people in the communication space. And learning is what we will get from our next speaker. But before I go to her, I just want to re-emphasize again who our speakers for the day will be. We have Ms. Eba Kalondo. She's the AU spokesperson in the Commissioner Musa Faki's office. That's as senior as you can get in the AU office. And we have Ms. Guguntuli, who's the Group Executive for Corporate Affairs at SABC. She'll be talking about leading communications during a pandemic. We also have Ms. Fatima Wane, a journalist based in France, a similar organization that Ms. Kalondo used to work for, France 24 International News. And we also have Dr. Oscar van Heerden, a scholar in international relations, with his focus on international political economy today. And we'll also have a closing of remarks by Tasneem Karim, a long-standing civil servant. Let's welcome now Ms. Eba Kalondo. Ms. Eba Kalondo is a spokesperson, as I said, in the chairperson's office in the African Union Commission. Prior to that, she held several senior positions in strategic and risk communications at the World Health Organization Foundation, Hirondelle, and France 24 and Reuters. Ms. Kalondo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for having me. And it was lovely to hear from the Director General Williams in terms of the response capacity from South Africa in terms of the communications work stream in terms of the response in South Africa. And that probably does then set the tone in terms of what you call learning. You know, I think and it strikes me quite significantly that for the most part, many countries are learning about pandemics in South Africa and around the world now. And yet Africa has had extremely meaningful lessons to learn, which we gleaned from the 2014-2015 West African Ebola pandemic. And that was the first time when a public health emergency of international concern, like the current COVID-19 pandemic, is now really struck Africa, but as a global pandemic with SARS and MERS before it. The epicenter was in West Africa for the first time, and also for the first time outside of rural and really remote areas of the world into urban centers and hubs, which then spread the virus even further. And then we saw in 2014-15 exactly the difference of what a pandemic is as opposed to an epidemic, for example, and especially a pandemic with great potential for spread internationally and nationally, and one that can completely dislocate and dismantle socioeconomic gains, and in turn introduce a new spectre of political instability, like we did see in West Africa at the time. So what the African Union was able to do from lessons learned from that, and I'm really going to try and condense this as much as I can, is that the heads of states of the African Union at the time decided, actually, we can't do this again. We cannot do this again and not be as unprepared as we were, fully cognizant of the level of health systems on the continent. And it was really because of the lessons learned in 2014 and 15 that Africa CDC was then created. It was a decision of heads of states to set up a technical agency of the African Union to deal with public health emergencies and public health threats. Also, it was also at the time that heads of states of the African continent were able to see that there are international instruments that all African member states, in fact, the entire globe, encompassing all of the global membership of the World Health Organization. We are all signed onto something called the International Health Regulations, which is the only international law that governs public health and public health emergencies, putting it within the sphere of global health security concerns. And when you do come to a public health emergency of international concern like we are seeing now with COVID, all of this we've seen with Ebola 2014 and 15. And one of the biggest lessons was that, and this is part of how the continental response today, which is being coordinated by the Africa CDC, has incorporated those lessons of the need to collaborate, to communicate, and more importantly, possibly to coordinate, to collaborate, communication, and collaboration. And that began on the 20th of February this year, after Africa registered its first COVID-19 case in Egypt on Valentine's Day, on the 14th of February. Almost a week later, the entire membership of African health ministers held an emergency meeting in Addis Ababa to come up with a continental plan for that collaboration, coordination and communication. And it is that continental strategy that has been in place since the 22nd of February that is being fanned out across the continent and domesticated throughout the AU membership. And that is really where the African Union is leading. When we talk about communication, this has always been a learning curve, because one thing that we see from one pandemic to the next, and what people forget, is that Africa is probably host to the biggest number of public health threats on the planet. We've had pandemics before. In fact, when COVID-19 came to pass, we were already dealing, and I'm sure Jessica Ilunga will tell you about this, we were dealing with an Ebola pandemic, which was also a PHIC, for almost 2 years. So that's why Africa was better prepared, because we have experience of pandemics. And DRC, and I'm sure Jessica Ilunga will talk about this, is paradoxically one of the most prepared countries to deal with a public health emergency of international concern, for the sole paradoxical reason that it has had so many before to deal with. And we're not talking, whether we're talking about cholera, whether we're talking about Zika, whether we're talking about Ebola, and whether we're talking about yellow fever. So the experience in dealing with public health emergencies of international concern has really been well covered on the continent. And if you do see places like Liberia or Sierra Leone, where I was serving for the United Nations during 2014 and 15, is that one thing that was very clear is that communication during a pandemic is not communication during peacetime, because people don't listen in the same way, nor impart and receive information in the same way when they are panicked and anxious and are not sure of what tomorrow will bring, and the lack of autonomy that brings with it. And so communications really is the foundation of how governments run their national responses. And we've seen this, that all AU members now have what we call our emergency operation centers, where there's sort of an integrated incident management system, of which risk communications is a really integral part. Because what it does, it is the transversal link to all of the areas of work needed to be able to mount a response. And basically what risk communications does is not just to communicate. I think a great part of communication during a pandemic, when people are feeling out of control and they're therefore angry and distrustful, is credible communication from one source that remains consistent. And a great part of that communication, what we've learned in from 2014 and 15, is actually not communicating at all, but listening, real active listening, to understand how people perceive what it is that they are living. Whatever communications messages you give out, unless they are understood as they are intended, they mean nothing. So listening has been a very integral part of communication in pandemics, because you are dealing with uncertainty, with distrustfulness, where the public trust in governments may or may not be at optimum levels. And also what pandemics do is that they bring into focus existing fault lines of inequality, because the pathway of pandemics is inherently political. It comes from the most neglected areas and then it moves forward. And I think what governments are starting to realize now, that if community-led and community-owned instances of communication and engagement, I like the word engagement rather than communication, because it has to be two-way, is extremely crucial to be able to paper over those existing inequalities that just become glaring in the full glare of light. And also, it also weakens the political and social contract of that society, meaning that pandemic responses, whether they be public health or community-led or economic, have to be all of society types of responses, which can only be led and be successful if they are owned, to be trusted by the community. It cannot be the politics leading, it has to be the science, but it can only be the science if that science can then be translated into something that is understandable, that can also be interrogated by the stakeholders in ways that they are most comfortable with. And this is what governments and societies are learning today, and I'm sure we'll hear about it during the course of this afternoon, how the media is as challenged as the rest of society, whether it be the government that is leading the national response, whether it is the community that is bearing the brunt and trying to protect themselves in ways that make sense to their belief systems. And the media as an integral part of communicating not only the risk, but also the protection measures that you can be to be able to protect yourself, your community, and your country, is that the only one thread that links all of us together is trust. That's the only currency. And it's to build it, to establish it, to maintain it, and know that when it takes a hit, to acknowledge what you've done wrong, what it is that you're going to do to make it better, and do it. So I'm really interested in the conversations that might follow today, because at a continental level, what we are seeing is this new expression of the current status of the social contract in all its diversity, and how the legitimacy of our leadership, whether it be political or otherwise, or even in the communication space, is how to be a credible voice by being truthful. It's not about what we know. And I think part of the communications in pandemics is rather talking about what we don't know, because what we're doing is dealing with uncertainty. Let me stop there and listen to the rest of the.
Well, we could listen to you forever, really, but thank you so much for such a thoughtful presentation, Ms. Kalondo. And I just want to ask you, leader after leader has come up to say that because this pandemic was jumped on the world, there was no way anybody could have prepared for it. What sort of tips would you have for communicators in situations? I know you say that Africa is one of the most prepared continents because we are more at risk than other continents. But how can communicators prepare for scenarios that are jumped on them and they're not fully prepared, but have to send out messaging in relation to those situations?
You know, I think humility, because the thing is, nobody expects you to know. when these things are such sudden occurrences, and nobody expects you to be an epidemiologist when what you are is a communicator. I think part of the, I don't want to say the beauty, but one of the levelers of public health emergencies is that, you know, everybody is challenged by it, whether from our belief systems and also from our skill set. I don't expect a journalist to be able to talk like an epidemiologist. What I would expect is that, you know, you ask and say, look, there's this thing called COVID. What is it? And what is it not? And what does it mean? And what does a pandemic mean? I think really this is where the beauty of communication happens, is it goes right to its basics. You ask, what is it? I don't know what it is, so find somebody who does. And then you are able to, as a communicator, then translate all of that gobbledygook, jargony, technical advice into something that not only makes sense, but more importantly, during a pandemic, people need to be reassured, but not overly reassured, because you cannot overpromise in a fast changing environment where even the facts change, because we're all going through it for the first time. So it's a thin balance, isn't it?
Absolutely. But thank you once again. And as we try to digest all of the wonderful things that you've just said, let's just remind all of the participants today that we're running a poll. The questions will keep coming up on the screen and you can engage with them and answer some of those. And we'll be looking at the results at some point in the conversation. For now, let's play a short video and thereafter we'll be introducing our next speaker.
Please follow our 7 steps to help prevent the spread of COVID-19. No face mask, no entry. You should always wear a face mask when you come into a public building like this one to help contain the spread of COVID-19. Don't stand too close to other people. Please stand at least 1.5 meters away from other people. Follow the floor markers for physical distancing. Go through temperature screening. As a precautionary measure, all staff and visitors are required to go through temperature screening. Remove your gloves upon entering. You should follow strict hand washing and sanitization procedures. Use hand sanitizer. You can use your own sanitizer or wet wipes in the presence of security personnel only if there is proof that these have at least 70% alcohol concentration. Only 3 people are allowed inside the lifts. Staff or visitors who are fit and younger are encouraged to use the stairs. Wash your hands with soap for 20 seconds. You should always use soap and water to wash your hands after using the bathroom. Scrub your hands for at least 20 seconds. Let's continue to stay safe and stay at home. Together, we can beat this.
Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us through that little direction in terms of directives, in terms of how to handle our lives. It's called the new normal. Our next speaker, Ms. Kalondo, while speaking, referred to her quite a bit, which gives one the sense that they probably know one another. Jessica has got such a diverse CV, senior positions in communications, but she's also a master's graduate from the University of Cape Town. But what she really is focusing on today is how she led communication during the Democratic Republic of Congo's most dangerous Ebola outbreak. Ms. Ilunga, thank you so much for making the time. You may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Desiree. And hi, everyone.
Hello.
Yes, I prepared a short presentation. I don't know who's going to share the screen. Should I share it or the organizer will do it?
You can share it on your side, Jessica. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to do it. Is that okay?
That's perfect.
Perfect.
Okay. Great. So yes, I was asked to talk about my experience leading communication of the Ministry of Health in DRC during one of its like no, not one of it like one of the largest Ebola outbreak in the country's history. And so here is what I'm going to talk about, just to give you a little bit of background. So DRC has a long history with Ebola. So the virus was discovered in the country in 1976. Since then, we've had 11 Ebola outbreaks. So I was working on the 9th and the 10th Ebola outbreak between 2018 and 2019. And just this year, when the 10th Ebola outbreak ended in June 2020, well, you had another one coming back in the Equator province in July 2020. So now they are dealing with a new Ebola outbreak. And so, like, it was interesting. The talk of Eba was really nice because she mentioned how communication during crisis, like during a pandemic, is not the same as communication during peacetime. And so in any case, any crisis will bring its loads of challenges. But then for the 10th Ebola outbreak, we had even more challenges and complexity on top of that. So first of all, the outbreak occurred in the provinces of North Kivu and Ituri, which have been like affected by violence for more than 2 decades. And so you have hundreds of armed groups which are active, and actually like insecurity was a major issue during the outbreak. And I think every week you would hear about people being killed by armed groups in the areas where we were operating. So it was like a major challenge. Then you also have the fact that North Kivu was also one of the most densely populated province in DRC. And as Ebola spreads by close contacts, obviously it was way more difficult to kind of control the outbreak in cities where you have million inhabitants living closely together compared to when you have to deal with the same outbreak in a village where you might have maybe 50 people living there with almost no relation or contacts with the rest of the city, I would say. Then we also had like a high population mobility because population in North Kivu are known for being traders, so they travel a lot within the region and also also sometimes outside the region and outside the country. So for instance, the cities where you had the Ebola outbreak, people have close trade connection with Rwanda or Uganda, Burundi. So it was also a major challenge to kind of keep the virus within the country. And then the timing of the outbreak was also quite crazy because it started, or the outbreak at least was officially detected just 4 months before the long-awaited presidential elections that had been delayed for 2 years. So political tensions were extremely high. People were suspicious. And so in terms of building trust, which is essential in an outbreak, it was like almost impossible. I think nobody even believed that we would be able to really convince people that the outbreak was real and that they would accept that, no, it wasn't just a plot by the government to further delay the elections, or because that's exactly the type of things we heard from the population. And so here is just some kind of a summary of the outbreak, some key numbers. So it lasted for 23 months. You see that in terms of casualty, it was quite high. So we had never had an Ebola outbreak that made so many victims. And you see, and also like a peculiarity of this outbreak was that a lot of children were also contaminated. And we actually did a few research to try to understand how come so many children between 0 and 5 years old were more at risk than previous outbreaks. So I think they are still trying to figure this out. I haven't seen any kind of a conclusion yet. And then you can see in terms of the footprint, so it affected like 3 provinces of the countries. And like some of the big successes were in terms of vaccination, where we had almost 304,000 people who were vaccinated. And travelers, we had like 180, almost 182 million travelers who were screened within the countries, because we had health checkpoints across the country, across the province, and at the borders to take temperature and also to ask people to wash their hands to help stop the spread of the virus. So in terms of communication strategy, it was quite interesting because when I started, I realized that despite a long history with Ebola, the Ministry of Health had basically no clear template or no kind of basics for a communication strategy. So I pretty much had to start from scratch. But what was good is that just maybe, I think it was in 2018, before the 9th outbreak started, I had the chance to attend a training by WHO called the ECN training, the Emergency Communication Network training, which actually gave me kind of the basics that I needed to then, I would say, face the outbreak with more confidence and not, knowing a little bit what I was doing. Because before working at the Ministry of Health, it's true that I had no specific expertise in health communication. I had worked in a communication agency in London. And so I was working on so many different, I would say, sectors, but not necessarily health. So having this training actually helped me to start with, to start building something that, help us deal with that. So in terms of my communication strategy, the first part was the vision. And I think it was really, what was really important for me was that the Ministry of Health had to be a trusted and credible source of information on the outbreak within the country, but also internationally. And that's something that is not necessarily easy, especially like considering the period, because the period, like I said, the political tensions were quite high. And so I would say that the Congolese government was not the most trusted voice out there. And so for me, it was really important to build that reputation and make sure that people trust what we were, like the information we were sending out. And also the second objective for me was to make sure that by communicating in a timely and also transparent manner, we would be able to reduce misinformation and mitigate the negative effects of the Ebola crisis on DRC overall economy. And that's something that actually I learned from the 2014, 2016 West Africa Ebola outbreak, because we saw how that outbreak, which affected just a number, like a small number of African countries, ended up having a massive impact on the overall economy of the entire continent. And so for me, it was really about trying to avoid that, to avoid having people panicking, taking rash decisions like, oh, we're gonna stop flying to the RC, or we're gonna stop trading with the RC. So it was really like, it was a very important point for me. And everything I was doing was aligned with those two main objectives I had. And so then after that, what you have to do, like after I had, let's say, defined my vision, I knew that we had to deal with a lot of national and international actors, right? And so one of the first steps was for us to identify those actors, the stakeholders, understand their concerns, and define how we would reach them and what type of messaging we would send them. Because obviously your communication channels and also your messaging will be adapted to each group. And so here I gave like a few examples of like national stakeholders and international stakeholders that we identified. Then we have, in terms of messaging, I would say that effective messaging during a crisis has 5 key elements. And I think that Eva already mentioned a few of them. So the first one is, of course, responsiveness, because a crisis will create an informational void. And if the government does not respond quickly, then someone else will fill the void, and often that void will be filled by misinformation. And when you have misinformation, it's way harder to counter than just be the first one to provide the right information, right? Then you also have honesty, which is extremely important, because when a crisis starts, you don't necessarily know everything, okay? And it's actually fine not to know everything, but you need to be honest about it. You need to be honest about what you know and what you don't know, and then tell people that you will keep them updated as new developments come up, because it's better to say that than to lie and then have to face the lie, because then you completely lose people's trust. And that's something that is really hard to regain, especially during those type of crises. Then you have simplicity, because public health is a technical field. Not everyone understands the lexicon. And that's something that I found quite funny, because I would work with all those epidemiologists and like public health experts, and they would like tell me all the great things they were doing. But then most of the time I was like, okay, right, but then what does that mean? Like, you know, I have to explain to people in general terms what you mean. And it's really important to find simple ways to explain to people what is going on, what the government is doing to solve the problem, and what you can do to protect yourself, so that you can improve the acceptability of your interventions within the community. Then you have, of course, compassion, which is important, because obviously people are panicking. And so when they are panicking, you will have a lot of crisis, you will have a lot of criticism, and people might not be nice to the government, but then at the same time, you have to understand where it comes from. And so you should always try to remain compassionate and avoid stigmatizing the population. You know, it's true that we often say, oh, well, the outbreak could be over if you had just, if the population had just respected the preventive measures, but then that's just not how it works. You need to always do your best to not put the blame on them. And then you obviously have empowerment, because for me, like, crisis communication is a teamwork between the government and the population. The government has its part, but the population also has its part. So it's really important that in the way you communicate, you show people, you make them feel that they are not powerless, that even them at their level, they can take decisive actions that will help end the outbreak. Then in terms of communication channels, it was quite interesting, because when the outbreak started, like, the Ministry of Health website was down and it had not been used for ages. So we pretty much had to find alternative ways to get our information out quickly. And so that's how we started using kind of new ways to reach people, and they ended up being quite effective, and even more effective than we initially thought. And so, for instance, the first communication channel we used was an email distribution platform. And so every evening, I had to send what I call the daily Ebola updates to national and international stakeholders. So basically, those updates were divided into two parts. You had first kind of the epidemiological situation with the numbers, the cases, the number of people who were vaccinated. But then you had a second part with the news, which were actually the most important parts for me, because like I said, I wanted to be able to tell the story from the fields, because I wanted to show the work that Congolese healthcare workers were doing. And for me, it was really important because having witnessed the Ebola outbreak, I was living in Belgium at the time. It's quite interesting because you can see that in the media, international organizations, international NGO dominate the narrative. And when they do that, it pretty much means that when you read the news, you have the impression that all those international experts or so, they come and save us Africans. While in reality, when you look at what's happening on the field, we are doing like most of the job. So for me, it was really important to have this place where I could showcase the work that we're doing by local healthcare workers. Then we had WhatsApp. I also created WhatsApp groups simply because I noticed that Congolese journalists very rarely check their emails. And so the easiest way to reach them was via WhatsApp. So I started sending them the daily updates on WhatsApp, but then they would also, like a lot of journalists would contact me and ask me questions, because you realize that the majority of journalists in DRC had no idea how an outbreak, I would say a response works. And they had a lot of questions on all the terminology and all the stuff. So I created those groups where like, okay, you're asking me the same questions. Let's create this group so that everyone can benefit from the sharing of knowledge and experience. And initially those groups were only for national journalists, but in the end, even international journalists ended up joining the groups because they found it was a very good way to receive the information directly from the government. Then we also obviously use social media. We were very active on social media because it's a cost-effective way to keep people informed, to share protective measures, and also counter misinformation. And so we will talk a bit more about it a bit later in the presentation. And then, of course, we also use traditional media, radio, TV, to share the content to rural communities, but also people in the cities. In terms of media relations, so media is extremely important because they remain the primary channel to widely disseminate information and opinions. So you have to learn how to deal with them during a crisis. So obviously the first step is to set up a media monitoring system so that you can quickly identify, let's say, like what is being said about the outbreak, what is being said about the government response, so that, and also see if there is any incorrect information that you need to respond to. And so you can actually react more quickly and more effectively when you have a good media monitoring system. You also have to learn to deal with negative press coverage. And I think what is interesting with negative press coverage is that I do not, I would say I find it can be helpful. Why? Because it can help you identify gaps in the response. Like for instance, when we were in Kinshasa, the outbreaks were happening like thousands of kilometers from where the central government is. And so we rely on information sent by our teams on the ground, but sometimes they don't want to, let's say, talk about or mention their shortcomings, okay? And so, for instance, I remember once I learned that there was, that some teams at health checkpoints did not have enough screening material through an article. I think it was the Washington Post, because he had the journalist who was there in the field and he just pointed out that gap. And so obviously that article allowed us to quickly check with the team and be like, okay, what do you need? And let's solve the problem quickly. So it can be a good thing sometimes. Then you have the spokesperson, which is really important, because the golden rule of government crisis communication is that not everyone can speak for the country during a crisis. It's really, really important to make sure that you have consistent messaging, because if you have too many people talking and like speaking in an uncoordinated way, you will just create confusion within the population, and that confusion would lead to losing people's trust, and that's something you cannot afford. So you need to really coordinate and be consistent with your messaging.
Yeah.
And then another part that was interesting was training for journalists, because from my time spent in DRC, I never met a journalist who had specialized in health communication. And so, but since you have to rely on them to relay information correctly to the population to ensure behavior change, we had to organize training sessions for them to explain them some kind of basic things on outbreak and managing an outbreak. So for instance, it might seem very easy, but then you have all those terminology about confirmed cases, suspect cases, probable cases. Like at the beginning, people were so confused, but then eventually they started getting quite good at it. And so I'm happy, because actually some journalists, some local journalists were even hired later on by some international NGOs or organizations to help out with that. So I was quite proud of that. And then, yeah, social media and fake news, that's a very big issue, because basically we used to say that we had an outbreak within the outbreak, because misinformation, it was the first time that we had to face such a big amount of misinformation on the outbreak. And that misinformation even came sometimes from opinion leaders, which makes it even more difficult to counter and to react to. And so I would say that the main lessons that I learned from that outbreak was that you must correct false information as quickly as possible, because if you waste time and you do it not quickly enough, let's say that misinformation will be like, people will consider it as being a fact, and then it will be really hard to try to do like to convince people that no, it's a false information, and to give them the correct information. Then you should never underestimate the power of misinformation, because sometimes you might read something that might seem stupid to you, but then that doesn't mean it cannot have a bad impact on people's behavior. So you need to really take everything seriously and try to respond as much as possible. And then also set up a social media monitoring system, because as I said, fake news spread mainly through social media. So you need to find ways to spot them and respond quickly. So now I will talk about, I will finish my presentation by talking about some of the key successes we have and some of the key challenges. So in terms of key successes, we had youth engagement, because the population is quite young. But what I noticed when we were working on risk communication and community engagement strategies with, I would say, international partners, I found that they were missing, let's say they did not have activities or ways to really reach the youth. They had the traditional ways of, doing like using local, like community radios and stuff. But then you also, I found like, I felt like young people wanted to also be engaged in a different way, and not just be like not just having us there telling them what to do, right? And so that's why we try to use alternative ways to engage with them and to kind of get them on our side. And for instance, we organized an intercity football tournament because a lot of young people were really into football, and so we used that tournament to also raise awareness about the disease. And because during the break, you would have small, I would say, actors doing small plays about the virus to, teach people the like protective measures. Then another success was getting DRC voice heard, and that's what I said with our daily updates. And it's something that is like important because when we think about it, we cannot imagine having an article talking about the COVID-19 pandemic in Europe with only having experts from Asia or Africa giving interviews. Yet when it comes to crisis in Africa, we are so used to have those articles in international media where you would have only like American or European so-called Africa expert like giving their opinions and no one from the country or no African voice out there. So for me, it was really important to make sure that every time people talk about the outbreak in DRC, you should at least have some kind of a Congolese or at least an African voice in the reporting. And I think it was quite interesting to see that for the COVID-19 pandemic, I was quite happy to see the African Union step up because they were really the voice of Africa that would bring more balance and objectivity in the reporting on the outbreak on the continent. And so another key successes was that we managed to get a limited disruption to the country's economy because we really made sure that we stayed in close contact with all national and international economic players to make sure that they do not take rash decisions. They continue working by obviously respecting the measures to protect their employees. And so that was, in my opinion, a big success. And also the partnership with local journalists. Like I said, we had a very close partnership with those WhatsApp groups, with the trainings. We really created this relationship of trust with local media. And so in terms of key challenges, obviously the main challenge was really to have community engagement and ownership because, like I said, the province, the zone has a long history of violence, and like in the population tends to be fearful and do not trust outsiders. And it was interesting to see that even if we were all Congolese, coming from a different region, for them, we were outsiders. And so it was hard to really build this relationship where they would allow us to enter their community. But then, of course, we had to work with opinion leaders, traditional leaders to get our way into the community. And then I would say that this challenge that was already a big challenge was kind of strengthened it was strengthened by other challenges like the political interferences. And so, like I said, the timing was very sensitive because we were just a few months ahead of the elections. And so you had some political leaders who clearly used the outbreak as an opportunity to boost their popularity. But how they did that was by pretty much reinforcing conspiracy theories on the outbreak, which was terrible. So it actually created a lot of mistrust. And that's also what led to a lot of violence, like community violence against Ebola responders. And sometimes we did have a few responders who actually got killed due to this community violence. And then I talk about international interferences, but it's more in the sense that what I noticed by my experience dealing with this Ebola outbreak is that, like I said, international partners often dominate the media or the narrative in the media, but sometimes they kind of exaggerate or dramatize some events because they need to raise funds, okay? And so that noise that they created was sometimes really annoying because, okay, they think that, oh, they think they are talking to their donors in, you know, Europe or the US, but actually, like, the world has become a big village. So what you're saying in Geneva or what you're saying in New York, people in Beni or in Goma, they have access to that information. And so sometimes people, like, by sending those mixed and alarmist messages, they sometimes accentuated the fear within the communities. And so it was a bit challenging to deal with that. And then, yeah, I would say as a conclusion, it was a very hard experience, but it's also a very humbling and intense human experience. I learned a lot, and I'm sure that, like, all the people and communication experts who are now working on the COVID-19 outbreak, I'm sure, like, COVID-19 pandemic, they will also have quite a few good lessons to share with us in the future. So yeah, that's it.
Oh, absolutely. I imagine they will have lots of lessons that they will be sharing in the future. Thank you so much. An amazing presentation. I hope you will be sharing that presentation with all of the participants because it looks like it's just so full of information. I just want to ask you a few questions, Ms. Ilunga. The DRC is a multilingual country, about 242 languages that are spoken in that country. How were you able to go around that?
Well, the thing is that there is no way around it. You have to adapt to your community. So basically, we had to translate all the communication material. We had to work with native speakers because that's the only way you can actually reach people. Because if you come, and since, you know, also there is this, I would say, it's not ethnic divide, but there is some sensitivity in that region, like I said, about being outsiders.
Yeah.
They could speak French. Even if they could speak sometimes Lingala, they were not happy about it. You had to speak Swahili to make sure that, you know, they would accept what you're saying and trust you.
So what are the cost implications of such a big language layout?
Well, it definitely increases the cost because you have to translate everything, like every material, every radio program you create, you must translate it in the different languages. And I think we had to translate them in maybe three different languages all the time.
Yeah. Another question I want to ask you, you kept referring to national and international stakeholders. Just some clarity, the strategy you were working on, the communication strategy you were working on, was it internal, external, or combined?
Mia was more working on the external communication strategy of the government, but then we also had the let's say the risk communication strategy that was focused on the communities and which goal is behavior change, right? But then here I gave a broad overview of the communication strategy towards the outside world.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you once again. A round of applause as we go on to our next speaker, who is keeping African markets and the African story alive in France. Let's now welcome Ms. Fatima Wan, who's a journalist for France 24 International News, and just to give us a sense of how you have been handling reportage on the pandemic. Bonjour, Mewan. Fatima, are you there? I'm going to ask for assistance from the administrator, just in terms of seeing if we're able to locate Ms. Fatima One.
Thank you, Chair. It seems like Fatima is not on the platform. Maybe
Okay.
there was a problem with connection. We can get back to her in a while.
All right, so we will move on to our next speaker, which is Mrs. Guguntuli. Mrs. Guguntuli is Group Executive for Corporate Affairs at the SABC, and her presentation today is on leading communications during a pandemic, media impact on society during this time. Ms. Ntuli, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I'm going to just share my presentation, the screen. Let me know when you can see it.
We absolutely can.
Okay, fantastic. We've had some fantastic speakers already. I think from Honorable DG and Madame Kalondo and now Jessica, all touching on very salient matters that we need to consider as communicators within a sphere of pandemics and epidemics on our continent. I think, colleagues, what I'm going to touch on today is slightly different, related obviously in the sense because we are communicating, but I wanted to look at an integrated approach to communicating during a pandemic, and perhaps that could give us some sort of a sense of how best we can conduct our communication so that it's impactful to the publics that we serve as media. So please let me know when you can see. Okay, great. So essentially, I'm going to just touch on the changing environment, which I think most of us are aware of, and then talk about what this integrated communications approach is like, and then I'll dissect that into the various phases. And I'd like to maybe make some comparisons or take examples from how we have managed the HIV versus the COVID-19 pandemic before I then conclude. So initially, I think it's fair to say that the landscape in which we operate as practitioners, media houses, communicators within the continent is fast changing. And the availability of media content essentially is actually spurring and driving this particular change. And more so, I mean, Jessica just touched on the languages in the DR Congo at the moment. Much of the content that's actually being generated is in languages other than English. So during a pandemic or an epidemic, in fact, epidemics first, of course, then a pandemic, such as the HIV pandemic that we saw, and more recently the COVID-19, there's always a rise, and certainly we are seeing it now in a dangerous rise in infodemic, because essentially misinformation has become more prolific. Over and above that, we then get fake news that gets fueled specifically because you know, social media platforms tend to favor click-worthy platforms, even if they are not necessarily accurate. So it makes the environment quite challenging for practitioners, media practitioners, communicators, as well as journalists in general, in assuring public of correct and reliable information. Then, of course, we have the impact of behavior on society that pandemics present, and the prolific information actually is a consequence of that. It causes a lot of panic, and people have to change behavior in order to safeguard themselves. However, the confusion in which information is correct and incorrect often delays that process. And then, of course, I think across the African continent, we have experienced that the public don't necessarily always trust information that is coming from the media, partially because there's a perception that some of the media houses or media are closely aligned to government, and sometimes there's a trust deficit there, which I think Madame Kalondo touched on earlier. For example, in Nigeria at the moment, it took a while for a lot of the people to believe that the pandemic was in effect affecting the population, because when they watched national television stations that are predominantly governed by the state, they felt that they cannot trust that information. It was only when they started to see some politicians dying that they thought, oh, maybe there is something to this pandemic. So effectively, the environment for journalists, for media, is really complex. And I think that in a pandemic setup, there's a real need for media to work very closely with authorities, the government, in order to ensure that information that's disseminated to the public is actually factual and correct. In addressing an integrated approach to communication, as I think, first of all, I think all of us are consumers of media content, and so we need to appreciate that if we're actually communicating with the view of actually changing lives or having an impact in society, or in fact ensuring that behavior is changed such that people's lives are safeguarded, people are well informed, then we need to understand that you can't just inform people about what is actually happening. There's a lot more that we need to do as media. So, of course, the first phase talks to addressing what is actually happening. Madame Kalondo alluded to the fact that we need simplicity, and Jessica also in her presentation, you need to be simple, you need to be factual and deliver the information timelessly. Over and above that, you need to look at the educational component and multi-channel approach to educating the public about pandemics and what is actually transpiring, how to protect themselves, and maybe some of the ills that actually emerge from those epidemics, how they must manage them in their lives. And in order to do that most effectively as media, we need the third phase, which is actually collaboration and partnerships. And many of the speakers have already touched on that before. As media, we know that we are most effective when we are in collaborations and partnerships, either with other social agents, government, civil society, the corporate, etc., NGOs, and the like. So if we have a look at the first phase of media's role in this kind of environment, we understand that our role really is to ensure that the public are well informed, and we actually continue to defend their right to know. So often we have to put ourselves at risk as journalists to actually deliver the information to the public, because the public expect it of us. They expect us to be in the line of fire, and wherever the news is breaking, we need to be there. Otherwise, we lose credibility. We are expected to provide information that is factual about epidemics and pandemics. We are expected to transmit it in all platforms that are possibly available, and it needs to be reliable, and it needs to be quick. And then also something that also was touched on by previous speakers is that we are expected to be empathetic and really to cover information in a sensitive manner. Now, media is often first to know information, and because obviously they are reliant on the authorities that are the owners of that information to disseminate that information to them timelessly. But media in Africa has also faced a lot of challenges in delivering information on time, largely because of the proliferation of communication as a consequence of internet, and as mentioned earlier, the misinformation. I was reading an article just last week on a study that was conducted by the Bruno Kelser Foundation in partnership with UNESCO, and they found that for coronavirus, 42% of the information that was shared on social media, especially platforms like Twitter, was actually incorrect. That is a lot of information, and effectively, you've got the effect of special interest groups there. You've got bots that are generating information, and so it becomes very difficult for the public to actually disseminate, or to be able to decipher what is true and what is not. So the credibility of media houses and media platforms is really quite important in actually assisting the public to safeguard themselves in a pandemic. And then, of course, I think that an association also with certain governments or government views is rather dangerous in ensuring that media is trusted by its public, which is what I've just highlighted. An example in Nigeria, that is what is happening, and across the continent and globally, in fact. An example, though, of good practice where we've seen some of the media activities that have actually led to information being shared timelessly and people knowing exactly what to do as a consequence, is when the first case of COVID-19 was reported in South Africa, where SABC actually streamed that information, and the ministers' briefings were streamed live, but also created a map on the website of all the hospitals that the public could go and access for testing and the like. That was available immediately. So it certainly assisted people to know where to go to receive some support or help. Of course, that's not enough. We all know that, that's just the first stage. That's the first phase. And you can see that that first phase perhaps saves some people. Some people get ill, but can then get some support. But effectively, it's not enough, because many people can still die, because it takes a while for people to change their behavior, to change their or in fact to even understand or have the information sink in. So you need another level of reinforcement, of resharing, and really assisting the people to understand what the impact of a pandemic or an epidemic is to their lives. This is where the education component comes in. Effectively, we have a major role in educating the public, not only because that we are perceived as the first point of information sourcing by the public, but because effectively there has been so much distrust by African publics with their governments and over time. So it really does matter to really educate the public even further. So during pandemics, typically African houses are expected to create more content around pandemics, and not only maybe to educate, but to really get people to understand the impact of those pandemics to their lives, to their livelihoods, to their ability to move, their ability to travel, to educate themselves, to go to school, etc., to be able to continue to live their lives as they have. So there is an expectation that new channels are created to create more access to education, as well as existing channels are enhanced with additional content that speaks directly to the pandemic or the epidemic, as is the case, as was the case with HIV across the continent, and right now with COVID-19. We're starting to see a lot of education programs targeted at readers, at listeners, at viewers, that specifically talk to how the public can protect themselves and measures that they can take to safeguard their livelihoods during pandemics. Across the African media landscape, we've also seen dedicated slots created on primetime television, digital platforms for educational content that speaks directly to COVID-19 in and around magazine programs, dramas that exist, soapies that exist. We've seen storylines changing that actually incorporate pandemics and what they're all about, also as a form of education, and children's programs being targeted to ensure that children understand what the various epidemics are and can also look after themselves. Over and above that, I think that media has a major role in actually not just pandemic or epidemic related content, but really content that actually assists during a pandemic in the ills that actually emerge as a consequence. So for example, we've seen quite a number of schooling programs that have gone not only digitally, but also radio and television platforms that have actually supported governments in ensuring that the curriculum for learners continues to be accessible, particularly because many of our learners don't necessarily have access to data or internet, especially in the remote areas. So media has actually played a major role in actually becoming the classroom to ensure that learners can still continue to further their studies. Social media in particular has played a major role, and while I touched on the fact that social media has had its woes in our society in particular, it has also played a very important role in ensuring that we've got access to education during an epidemic. The advancing technology is also going to be playing a major role for us as the media practitioners in ensuring that we can assist educational initiatives far more than what we have done in the past, particularly for print media, who have had to be forced under the current circumstances to review, and many of them have had to close down because, of course, the pandemic has put additional pressures to an already very difficult environment. But over and above that, I think that many of them have also had to look at how technology and the digital era must play a more central role in ensuring their survival, but also in their relevance in contributing to the education of the public. So with that second phase, we obviously see a response, or rather an impact to our communities and to our publics, that amplified educational content does tend to have a significant impact in terms of how people are better responsive to an epidemic and a pandemic. Finally, the third phase really talks to, really is what our role is as social agents, as the media. We really exist to ensure that we have an impact in society, that not only do we educate, not only do we inform, but we actually make a significant impact in changing lives of our society. And we can only do that by really partnering with other social change agents to ensure that our communities are best looked after during an epidemic. And of course, through the various platforms that we've got, whether it's TV, radio, print media, streaming, social, etc., we really have a major role in playing a change agent in our communities throughout the continent. Many media houses have had successful partnerships over epidemics and pandemics. I know that Ms. Jessica touched on some of those in her delivery. And these are really crucial, and that has to be part of the three-phase approach to us being more effective in terms of communicating. For example, one of the programs that stands out during the height of HIV infection in South Africa was Love Life, which was actually a program that was recognized by WHO for its effective impact on not only the awareness, but change impact that it had, particularly on young people in South Africa during the height of infection of HIV. Media also has played a major role in the recent COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa, where during the Easter break, all society were all under lockdown. So no one could attend their services, their church services during Easter. And of course, being a very Christian country, we are very, very reliant on our services and masses during this period. And media, in partnership with government and faith denominations, played a crucial role in ensuring that society is still able to celebrate their religious holidays and commemorate Easter, which is quite central to a Christian country like ourselves. So effectively, media's partnerships have played a role in a number of areas, particularly also in the surge of gender-based violence. And you'll see in the slides to come how media has particularly played a role in some of the ills that have actually emerged as a consequence of epidemics across the continent. And of course, with that third phase, the hope is that integration of an information approach, an educational approach, as well as changing the lives of individuals in society will culminate into ensuring that we are seeing fewer people affected by epidemics on the continent, and more people actually learning what the epidemics are about in time to be able to protect themselves and not only their health, but also livelihoods. So just very briefly, I wanted to touch on the HIV versus coronavirus response by the media. And the reason for this slide is actually to give you a context in terms of how the HIV pandemic, well, it's no longer a pandemic, but how as a pandemic it compared in size to coronavirus and what the response from the media has been like. So if I have a look at we start at the bottom, how the actual media actually played a role in breaking the news on the HIV versus the COVID-19 pandemic. Certainly here in South Africa, there were a number of issues because, of course, we had debates about whether or not HIV actually caused AIDS, and the delay in finalizing that particular argument actually caused a lot of unnecessary deaths, and there was a lot of misalignment between what was being said versus what the scientists were saying. So that actually was the focus for the media in the beginning of the infection in this particular country. Whereas either maybe because of the fact that there was a delayed infection here in Africa, we started to see what was happening in China, then in Europe, particularly countries like Italy. So by the time that we had our first case in Egypt, we had already seen what was going on globally. We also, because of social media being instant, everybody knows what's going on. I think we were better prepared to really cover the information effectively as media from the onset. Then, of course, we played a role in some of the social ills that emerged as a consequence of these pandemics and epidemics. From a xenophobic perspective, we know that initially there was a lot of prejudice against gay communities and people that were drug users at the time, especially because of needles, and media played a major role in highlighting the plight of those that were marginalized as a consequence of being positive. In the same light, media has played a crucial role, particularly in certain countries. Maybe not so much on our continent, but certainly there has been some prejudice against people of Asian descent in terms of whether or not they might be carrying the virus, etc., especially in the initial stages of the virus's development. Then, of course, from a border restriction, in both instances, we saw media playing a role in highlighting movement restrictions. First of all, I think certainly in places like the USA, there were lots of restrictions around people who were positive, and many other countries across the globe. And then, of course, from a COVID-19 perspective, because we've had to be based predominantly in the homes, mobility has been limited. Media also played a role in highlighting that. I won't go into the rest of the detail. I would like to share the presentation with you, but I think most significant for us really is the role that media has played in the gender-based violence fight. And I mentioned earlier that, for example, both with HIV and COVID-19, we've had severe issues of gender-based violence. Initially with HIV, media highlighted the fact that it highlighted some of the myths that were existing in society. For example, in South Africa, where people believed that sleeping with a virgin will actually cure your HIV status, and so that actually saw a rise in gender-based predominantly gender-based violence activity. And we see it now with COVID-19, where people are confined to small spaces with their abusers, and that certainly has exacerbated that situation. Now, very briefly, before I conclude, just a sense of what a broadcaster, one of the largest broadcaster on the continent, as an SABC, has done in both instances in terms of really trying to go beyond the news component. And of course, we know that our news wing is very, very strong. It certainly has been ranked as one of the most trusted news agencies in the country, and also is ranked one of the #1 service providers of relevant news in the country. So there's no doubt that there's significant trust in our news agency. However, over and above the news agency, whose major role is really to inform, the broadcaster has done a lot in terms of content development and partnerships to ensure that the public is always informed and and also decreases stereotype around people that are infected by the various viruses. So in the case of HIV, we've done a lot of extensive work that continues to be the case, because of course HIV is not gone, much to everybody's surprise maybe, because I was just looking at stats the other day. We've had 50,000 deaths between 1st of January and end of May in South Africa that are HIV related, and at the time we had 230 deaths of COVID-19. So very much HIV is still very much an issue, but it's managed and it's definitely no longer a pandemic. It's a disease that is very manageable right now. But in the period, we have had a number of award-winning series, children's programs, factual dramas, and extensive radio programming, award-winning radio programs that were funded by the Johns Hopkins University, intersections that won awards across the board, that were both on radio and television. And of course, we've had a similar response in terms of COVID-19 with children's programs, factual content, radio programs, as well as digital. In fact, one of the things that I think that we need to pride ourselves as a broadcaster are our initiatives around supporting education in this time, because many of our learners don't have access to internet or computers, and so they've had to rely on content from television and radio to ensure that their curriculum is completed for the year and they don't fall behind. So in conclusion, essentially, I think that one of the things I wanted to highlight with this presentation is that our approach has got to be multidimensional. It's got to be not only information focused, it's got to be education focused. We need to invest in that, and also look at how partnerships can play a role in ensuring that we are most effective as media in communicating during an epidemic or pandemic. So in conclusion, really there are many opportunities for us to be better communicators during pandemics on the continent. However, that does really require for us to be better resourced as media. We also need to have credibility and editorial independence within the view within the perceptions of the public. And we also need to embrace technology and understand that technology plays a major role for us in doing our job more effectively. But also the fact that, we must prioritize our own safety. Many times we talk about media in reporting, in bringing education to the people, but we also need to resource ourselves well to be able to safeguard our own health, because we are most at risk when we go out there, when we get information, etc., and when we're in the front line. And finally, and most importantly, and I think really echoing Honorable DG's comments earlier, is that we really are a part of social agents. And so media really must partner with government and other role players to ensure that information is disseminated to its public effectively and people ultimately benefit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nduli. Of course, due to my proximity, I have more insights into what you've just presented, and thank you so much for an amazing presentation. But just something Madame Kalando touched on, one of the challenges of communicating during a pandemic as opposed to peace times. She was just saying where your audiences are either panicked or anxious. Just give us a sense of South African audiences and how they have received all the COVID-19 messaging that has been coming out either from the World Health Organization or from government or from the SABC, or disseminated by the SABC.
I think that first of all, I must say that I think the government has been very, very proactive and created infographics that can be shared on the digital platforms that are quick and timeless, particularly after each delivery, either ministerial delivery or presidential delivery. That has been very, very well executed, which has made our job as the SABC much, much easier. Having said that, as I mentioned earlier, there's still a lot of misinformation out there. And so you have to assume that people are, especially because we are one of the countries that is highest active on social media, we are constantly receiving other messaging. So while that messages, though some of those messages were very well packaged and very good, we have other sources that are also just as interesting. And if we don't have ways in which we can ensure trust within the publics, it's very easy for that information to get lost, no matter how well packaged it is. So the role that we have had to play really in partnership with government is to really enforce some of those messages that have been shared from the onset, to ensure that once the minister speaks, information goes out, but then what happens thereafter? So we have programming, we have current affairs that has interviews, we've got programming on drama series that everybody is glued to, 10, 12 million people are watching on a daily basis. Let's get the messaging out there. And that's what we have been doing. And of course, as I mentioned, the partnerships have been central for really our message in ensuring that people buy into the safety measures that have to be adhered to, but also in making sure that they can somehow protect their livelihoods one way or the other.
Let me thank you once again, and at this point remind our participants that you're welcome to submit your questions and comments, and we will be dealing with those immediately after the next speaker, who I have previously introduced, but I'm just going to briefly do so once again. Fatima Wan is a journalist operating in France, working for France 24, representing Africa in that country. And Fatima, bonjour, Mewan.
Bonjour. Hi, Desiree. Thank you for having me.
Merci, merci. Please, you may start your presentation.
Okay, thank you. First, I wanted to thank you all for having me on this panel, Mrs. Williams and Ayanda Olo. So Desiree, thank you for this moderation. I'm really glad to be part of this conversation, given that I'm francophone. I'm working on a French TV. And every presentation so far was very enlightening. And I wanted to thank you all, and especially my ex and colleague and friend, Eba Kalondo. I'm so glad that I can see her now here. So my name is Fatima Tawan. I'm journalist for France 24, an international news channel based in Paris. I have worked for several French news channel and newspaper as well. I have covered politics, society, cultures, affair for 15 years now, during which I have the chance to meet several leaders, president, prime minister, CEO, and youth leader on the ground in Africa and abroad. My job gave me the opportunity to meet African in such different ways and levers that I wouldn't have the chance to encounter in other job. And I know that. And I do know that this is quite a blessing, right? I have started as a reporter writing for African magazine, and then I was given the opportunity to work for the most important international news channel in French, which is France 24, France 24. Today I'm presenting news in African bulletin called Journal de l'Afrique. And beside my job as a journalist, I have lunch with some friends, a platform dedicated to African culture called Action for African Culture. AAC 54 countries plus the diaspora. Our main goal is to mobilize the African world of culture, because we're convinced that culture can restore and somehow incentive the economy by producing meaning. Culture, as you all know, is an asset like no other, and cannot be reduced to its mere monetary value. And it's belongs to the people, and the prestige, coming with the culture make it exceptional. So as a journalist for 15 years now covering African politics, I've got the chance to see firsthand the power of the media on the daily basis. And furthermore, during a pandemic, which is why we're all here today. What I have measured is the weight of the most essential value at the very core of our job as a journalist, which is trust. And Eba talk us about it in her presentation. Trust is very, very important. And we as media cannot survive without trust. Trust is what we long for. Without trust, all our efforts somehow are vain. In our modern world, information is all over the place. People don't need us to get the information. That's what we know now. We're not anymore in the world where we're like among the happy few to get access to the information so we can pass it through the public. Nowadays, people come to us to verify the information. They wanted to know if the information they have heard through social media, which is now the very powerful platform, is accurate or not. This is why they basically come to us. And the COVID-19 has somehow changed it all, because we as a media, we know that the impact of our information was so powerful and direct somehow. At the very beginning, some countries really, they revealed their pitfalls of a non-free press or weak press, actually. So don't get me wrong, the response of the non-democratic countries weren't a surprise. But even from democracies, reliable information was lacking. People were desperate to know what to do. And in this void, somehow manipulation occurred. The social media, without any guidance, accountability, failed to help people to thrive during the pandemic. They were somehow lost, right? They needed to know what to do. And all they had were rumors, fake news spreading all over the world. And it was like a gigantic tsunami overwhelming the world while we're trying to not to get wet without towel as a shield, which is quite ridiculous, right? This crisis revealed the necessity of taking action to reinforce media structure all over the continent. African countries need massive investment into the media field because what is at stake is lives of people, millions of people, and if they get the wrong information. We had so many fake news at the beginning of the outbreak. And we heard that children died in Senegal from the COVID-19 vaccination, which was, of course, false. Consuming alcohol does protect you against COVID-19, etc., etc. We had a lot. Like it was like every day another battle of fake news that we had to tackle. And as a journalist, we quickly realized that somehow lie could kill even more than a disease. So we had to be very careful on what we're doing. But I get also something else, like this pandemic was also an opportunity for the journalists and every media responsible to focus on what matters most in this job, to rebuild the trust between the public and us, find new ways to get through every public, especially with the youth, reinvent stories, and last but not least, to cut blurry ties with business and politics circles, because this is where we lost somehow the trust that we're trying to build with the public. Those ties have broken too many systems, leading to the chaos, unfortunately, in so many countries. So that's it. Why I wanted to say to my fellow journalists and communicators, leaders, more than ever before, our job, it might not be a sinecure. It is certainly a vocation for which the only reward that we have is the sake of the population. So thank you. That's all I have to say to this platform, and I really thank you for having me on this panel today.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you
Merci.
so much for that wonderful presentation. Just give us a sense of the type of African stories you're covering in France, just in terms of the French appetite for African stories.
Desiree? Yeah, I didn't hear quite the question, but do you want to know what we're covering in French? Oops. Desiree? So maybe you want to know the kind of story that we have covered.
That's what she said.
Yeah, the network is so. I'm so sorry. I wanted to apologize because I'm in Guadeloupe and I'm in French. I'm not in France right now, so the connection is not that good that I was expecting. So I'm sorry for that. But basically, we in France 24, we covered basically every stories regarding African politics. And of course, this outbreak was a major challenge to us because we, the information coming through the ground was not that good at the very beginning. And we, in Le Journal de l'Afrique, which is the program that I'm working for especially, we're trying not to be so condescending with the public and trying to reach them through the information, the verified one that we had, not trying to, like Jessica Ilunga told us earlier, not trying to dramatize the information that we had, and trying to be the most accurate possible, the most actually doing just what we are expecting to do, like just our job, right? We are not epidemiologists. We know that Eba Kalando told us earlier. So we are not trying to do that. We're just trying to be focused, trying to be accurate, and trying to tell people with the most sincere and efficiency for the information available that we had in the meantime. And not we are not fear to say that we were wrong earlier. So if ever we get wrong information or we had been misled somehow, you know, it happens sometime in the job. So don't be afraid to tell to the audience that, okay, so we might have told you that this and this, but unfortunately this is not what happened, and here what we know now, and trying to stick to the information, the verified one that we had, and not trying to speculate, not trying to dramatize informations, because it could be dramatic. So we know that somehow people, and sometimes it happens that people, you know, because of the misleading information that they receive, it might cause, you know, effects which were really dramatic on the ground. So we're trying to be very, very cautious of what we're doing, given the information that we had on the ground, very cautious with the picture that we received, which is not at that time very easy to access to. So, and trying also, that was my main focus on the job, was to trying to put the light on what works on the ground also, because sometimes we had good news from the ground in Africa. The way that African countries has tackled, Jessica told about us, Ebola and DRC, with the quite good results that they had. So that was the main, that was somehow our focus on this epidemic, during this epidemic. It was to say, okay, this is a major crisis that happened. It's a pandemic, so all over the world people are affected. Even in, of course, in Africa, people are not spread. So we had to tell to African audience that this pandemic also affect Black people, because we heard that sometimes at the beginning of the pandemic, some people in Africa say that the COVID-19 was not affecting Black people, wasn't affecting African people. So, which is of course, you know, not true. So we had to fight against that kind of information, but at the meantime, not trying to dramatize, and telling people that, okay, in this country, this is what they, you know, what kind of measure that they had taken, and how the politics and the leaders on the ground have held and tackled the situation was interesting, and was the good way to tell people what happens on the ground. So just stick to the basic and doing our job the best way possible.
Thank you, Fatimata, for that input. We seem to have unfortunately lost Desiree.
I'm here.
Oh, good, you are here.
I'm
Thank
sorry.
you. Merci beaucoup, Fatima.
Thank you.
The gremlins are creeping in, but we've had such wonderful conversation so far. Fatima 1 is our penultimate speaker. Our last speaker will be coming up in a bit. But before we do that, we've been encouraging throughout the conversation for our participants to send through comments and questions. And at this point, we're going to bring in from the GCIS, Meme Mokhodzi, to take us through the comments and the questions. Immediately thereafter, we'll be taking a look at a short video before we introduce our last speaker for the day. Meme?
And thank you, Desiree, and good afternoon to all participants. I've got 3 questions for Jessica and 1 comment. I also have 3 generic questions for the other participants. I'm just gonna go ahead. It's from Margaret from Namibia. She says, greetings from Namibia. Thanks, Jessica, for such an insightful presentation. I learned a lot and will definitely try to incorporate some of the lessons learned. Did you have a regional? Did you have regional teams that you worked on in the DRC? And if you did, how did you coordinate this? And then another question is from Michael Karin from GCIS, and it's also to Jessica. It says, in South Africa, we have a rich African tradition of direct and mediated communications. So sessions like Imbizo and public gatherings between government and the people take place. What types of media platforms did you find to be the most effective in sustaining direct communication during the pandemic?
Should I reply now?
I'm gonna go through the last question, and it's from Kopo Ndlovu, who did not indicate where she's from. How much of the community has access to internet, or what is the typical profile of a social media user in your country, Jessica? And can I maybe read through the comment, the generic comment from Malawi? It's from the Center for Development of Journalism and Advocacy in Malawi. It says, it's a very enlightening presentation, Jessica. DRC and Malawi were in similar situations. It is an uphill to manage crisis within a crisis. For instance, COVID-19 crisis in Malawi was a mixed bag as the pandemic came at a time when Malawi was in a political crisis after the nullification of the presidential election. This meant that the run-up to the fresh presidential election, COVID-19 communications messages competed with election messages. The then government could not be trusted. So these are the 3 questions and 1 comment for Jessica.
Okay, thank you, Mimi. So in terms of social media users, it was quite interesting because it's true that internet penetration in DRC is generally quite low. But one of the most connected region was actually the one where you had the Ebola outbreak. And so that was quite interesting because that's also how we actually had to, like, we were not used to like go through social media or like use social media to reach people during outbreaks, but like for that outbreak, we had to include that in our strategy. And also that's what made it a bit harder because we had all that misinformation issue. So yeah, I think that would be the answer for that. In terms of media platforms to like have this direct communication with people, it's quite interesting because it's true that even in DRC, it was important for people to have direct contact with the government and the response team. And so what we did is actually that we did organize a lot of gatherings for different groups. Sometimes it was a gathering with a taxi driver, other times it was gathering with women traders from the markets. We had like gatherings with the students just because we had to go to people and really speak to them directly to like engage with them. And so what was quite good is that the minister himself was very like on the ground. So he really enjoyed being able to meet people and go talk to them and to try to tell them that, you know, take it seriously, this is a real issue. And so it was quite interesting because a lot of people would be like, oh, this is the first time we actually see a national minister coming in our region. So it actually helped a lot to sometimes gain people's trust in the communities, having those big gatherings. And then in terms of the coordination, so basically we had a very small team in Kinshasa at the Ministry of Health. So we were just 5 people, so it was really tiny. And we managed, like we worked with community engagement teams who were placed in the different hotspots of the outbreak, because how we had the response is that because you had such a big geographic footprint of the outbreak, we had different response teams, and in each response team you also have community engagement and communication teams, and so they were kind of our focal points in the field. So we would give them information to disseminate, but they would also collect and give us back some kind of the community feedback and things that we would use to adapt the communication. So I hope it is clear.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. And just to reflect that Kupon Dlovu is from our office, from the research team, the one who posed the question on one of the questions earlier. And I'm just gonna go through the next set of questions. Sinatemba, who is from Swaziland, says, in my country, we are really struggling with sending the messages across to people with disabilities, especially the deaf people, because journalists are not trained in sign language. How are the rest of the African countries doing this in this regard? And the next question is also a generic question. It says, South Africa has achieved great strides during the pandemic, especially in engaging the communities and flattening the curve. Unfortunately, the news about the personal protective equipment tender irregularities have a capacity of eroding the gains. How does the government intend to build moral resilience and ensure trust is maintained or regained from South Africans? The other question, yes, it says, it's from Elizabeth, who's the chairperson of the National Editors Forum in Namibia. She says, yes, Africa has experienced big pandemics like Ebola, yellow fever, etc. How far is Africa from developing its own vaccine?
Hi, I can answer probably a couple of the questions that were just put out. Meme, is this okay?
Yes, you can.
Maybe we'll start from the last one in terms of research and vaccine development. And this is probably one of the things that when we started this webinar, Director General Williams and somebody else was talking about learning, how we're all learning from previous pandemics. And so too can the media learn from what the media learned at the time in 2014, 15, during Zika, during yellow fever, and the last Ebola public health emergency of international concern. One of the in Mali, there are at least 5 countries which serve as regional hubs for their regions that are already and have been manufacturing vaccines. Yellow fever, for one. That would be South Africa. I can tell you of Mali and the l'Institut de Louis Pasteur à Dakar in Senegal. But for the longest time, and I think what some of these questions show is that we do not know where to find the information sometimes in terms to be a credible information receptacle. And I think this is what pandemics teaches the media, is that we know so little. We know so little about public health. We know so little about public health communication. And that is an opportunity to be able to know where should I go, and where are the resources in terms of experience, in terms of technical expertise, when I want to speak to and learn more so that I can better communicate on, say, vaccine development. What is the history of the continent, my country, my region, in terms of this particular area of work? And I can tell you that if you go back to the lessons learned with Ebola, is that we learned two things: that Africa is a big vaccine manufacturer and developer. We've been able to find extremely innovative ways to be able to find how to transport, deliver, and administer vaccines in places which have no cold chains, like in Guinea, which was the first place in the world, in Guinea Forestière. So it was sort of the southern part of Guinea where the index case for the 2014 Ebola outbreak came from, was also the first place in the world where we tested an emergency vaccine for Ebola in the world, which is also now the vaccine that is predominantly being used for the subsequent Ebola outbreaks afterwards, like the outbreak that Jessica worked on. But I think what I'm trying to communicate here is that there have been great firsts in Africa in pandemic response, in pandemic innovation. When we talk about ring vaccination of Ebola, it's the first time in the world that we had a candidate vaccine, because at the time the vaccine for Ebola that was administered in Guinea in the 2014 outbreak was an emergency vaccine, meaning it had not been fully cleared by the world's regulatory instances. But because of the fact that we were in a public health emergency of international concern, some of those parameters were then adapted to be able to use a candidate vaccine in ring vaccination in 2015. It was administered by Africans in an African country. It was the first experience and has now been scaled up globally and is a blueprint for ring vaccinations for any pandemic. Number two, I think that when we talk about how and where we communicate in terms of social media, Ebola is one thing. You know, the power of Ebola was not only in its deadly capacity in terms of transmission, because Ebola, like COVID, is a disease of touch, but way more lethal than COVID is. But what we have found with both Ebola and COVID is that we thought victory for Ebola was if you survived the disease. What we did not realize that as soon as you did survive it, there were new pathologies that came up in terms of long-term after effects of having survived the disease with Ebola, which included blindness, a certain type of deafness, and that how long you could keep the virus in your body for. With COVID, we are also just learning, and what people do not understand is that there's a very small word before COVID-19. It says novel. It's the novel COVID-19 virus. Novel means that it's never been seen before. So we didn't know anything about this pathogen until it came out, when we found out about it in Wuhan. So the thing is, what the media has a fantastic opportunity to be able to learn and communicate as we experience this hitherto never experienced virus, with either epidemiologically, either sociology, from a social point of view, and from a response point of view, and certainly from the political point of view, and how to communicate with people with a virus which demands social distancing. One of the questions was about, you know, the imbizos and the fact that people could gather. The thing about COVID is that you could not gather. And how to communicate is how to find in the creativity of media organizations who themselves are challenged in how they are able to work in terms of the social distancing, and then how they are able to impart that information, whether it be for able-bodied or for people with disabilities. And these are questions, I think, that you can find out from other regional organizations who are doing the same. Oude NEPAD, which is housed in South Africa, is also running these continental-wide webinars from Southern Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and North Africa, where you have a real wealth of information of your peers within the community of communications and media to find out how they are doing and how they've been able to adapt to the current operating environment, whether in terms of how do we communicate, how do we verify information, and who are our best areas to be able to get information from. I also want to possibly say here that every week in Addis Ababa, there's a webinar by Africa CDC, which is a global weekly media briefing like the ones that you would get from Dr. Tedros in Geneva, which serves exactly this purpose. So I would strongly encourage everybody on this webinar to be able to fan out and try and connect with other regional and continental efforts, including by Africa CDC, which runs a weekly media briefing, to be able to share and ask your questions with your peers from the continent as they respond, like yourselves, to the public health emergency that is upon us.
Thank you so much. Meme, I'm going to make a request in the interest of time. I noticed that we're going to overrun on time a bit, and I'm going to ask all our participants to please make an allocation for another plus minus 15 minutes. But Meme, can I ask that we cut short the questions and continue the conversation online, perhaps, if that's okay? Shall I get a go ahead on that?
Yes, that is fine. That is fine, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Shall we play the video as we remind the participants to please engage with and interact in the poll, which we'll be looking at in a bit after the next speaker. But for now, let's play that video.
When these measures are no longer needed. Until then, we must ensure that all our people receive adequate support. We will not spare any effort or any expense in our determination to support our people and protect them from harm. We will do whatever it takes to recover from this human, social, and economic crisis. Our country and the world we live in will never be the same again. We are resolved not to merely return our economy to where it was before the coronavirus, but to forge a new economy in a new global reality. Our new economy must be founded on fairness, empowerment, justice, and equality. It must use every resource and every innovation in the service of the people of this country. Our new economy must open up new horizons and offer new opportunities to all South Africans. Over the past month, South Africans have opened their hearts to each other. Even as we find ourselves at a moment of great peril and danger, even as great sacrifices are demanded, even as we dare not allow our vigilance to waver, we look ahead to a better future. I have faith in the strength and the resilience of ordinary South Africans who have proven time and time again throughout our history that they can rise to any challenge that is presented to our country. We shall recover. We shall overcome.
Well, there you have it. We shall recover. We shall overcome. A message from not only South African President, but also the chair of the African Union, President Cyril Ramaphosa. Let's bring in our next speaker now. Dr. Oscar van Heerden. Am I still audible to everyone?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Let's bring in Dr. Oscar van Heerden. He's a scholar in international relations, also currently director for operations at Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflections. And today he's talking to us about the political economy and how to send out political messages at this time. Dr. van Heerden, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Desiree, and thanks, colleagues. Very valuable inputs from everyone. I'll try and be brief. Lots have already been said, and so I'm going to try not to necessarily repeat, but suffice to say, when looking at the role of media during a crisis or epidemic, we generally think of three elements in terms of communications. There's, of course, the government and government communications. Then there's your traditional mainstream media, and of course, social and community media as well, which I want to also speak to a little bit in more detail. These are usually identified. Government communications is about press conferences, official websites, and insisting that there needs to be taglines on websites during pandemics. And of course, televised addresses, which we've seen to play quite an important role as the President of the Republic took the nation into confidence and kept us all informed as to the decisions, and a real sense of transparency as to why certain decisions were taken in terms of the lockdown, hard lockdown, and so on. The traditional media is, of course, your newspapers, television, radio stations, and of course, mainstream websites. And then, of course, there's your social media and community media, which is your social platforms, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, and so forth. And of course, your community radio stations and print media. Now, during a crisis, we talk of a command culture, which a lot of former and previous speakers have spoken about, structured communication that gives clear direction for people to actually adhere to. And so the media needs a society in different crises. There must be mature management of information. And I think a number of people have actually commented on this. Gugu spoke about it as a public broadcaster, but also Jessica and of course Ms. Kalonda, to talk about responsible information sharing. And so, if we have structured and trustworthy information, then people tend to follow it. And I think with the setup of the command and command council on the COVID pandemic here in South Africa, that is in close liaison with the cabinet, it gave a sense that information that was shared with the public was indeed trustworthy and so on. And of course, the normal roles of media in reporting, investigations, and so forth, in order to not diminish the importance of holding people accountable, particularly government and so on. I also think that from the three channels that we find, who act very differently, of course, government communications becomes a trusted source of authority, provided that it demonstrates transparency and, of course, retain trust within the process. Your traditional media, we find that with regards to the source is usually very critical, which is a good thing. But at the same time, we are saying that there needs to also be a balance with supporting government in getting the necessary information done, because it is so critically important, the sharing of information. Then, of course, social media, which is the unknown in the equation, and Fatima spoke a little bit on this in terms of the issue of disinformation, and I'll come to that a little bit later. Now, of course, when we talk of why social media in particular presents us with challenges, firstly, that they are structured for personal interest and not social interest per se. It is individuals or individual groupings that are trying to communicate particular messages and so forth. And they can give momentum to stories in unpredictable ways. We've seen it, for example, in a different context, Black Lives Matter and other protest forms, but meaning that, you know, media consumed is not always what we want or what we know, and this is sometimes a problem. It can also enable antisocial behavior, facilitating the propagation of rumors, including misrepresentation and identity issues, false and manipulated information, images and sounds. We see it all the time where an image is used to depict a current situation, only to find that it's actually an image of 3 years ago or 4 years ago, and has actually no direct relevance and bearing to the current situation. And then, of course, there's cyberbullying, coercion and harassment that also takes place on your social media platforms. And needless to say, not all the time, but in many cases, privacy is breached by social media. And so in a time of crisis and pandemics, it's really not the kind of issues that we would want to deal with when we try and communicate facts. We also have to acknowledge, and as much as there's the antisocial, they also support positive social behaviors, creating and distributing new social norms through social media. For example, the point that Ms. Kalonda was talking about, which is about masks and social distancing, sanitizing, washing of hands, that also finds very much emphasis and expression through social media. Naming and chastising undesirable behavior, as Fatimata was mentioning, you know, everyone with a cell phone is a journalist. And so when people are not behaving, when they are smoking or drinking or breaking the rules, social media platforms are also used to expose, chastise, and name and shame such. So that is a positive. And then, of course, it serves as discussion forums, you know, where people feel that because there's a huge grouping or network on the platform, they can actually serve as discussion points. The challenge is that there needs to be maturity for some users, and of course state regulatory framework to actually try and regulate how we begin to capitalize on the positive outcomes of social media. Now, in order to respond better in future, we have to appreciate a few things with regards to the sharing of information or the media. Firstly, around popularity. Celebrities, government agencies, well-known organizations can indeed have an influence and make sense of information that is being shared. Network-based content influence, which is about hardwired into a group or being an accepted member that is actually contributing to like-minded groups. I think that's critical. And as I said, one of the key issues is that information must be true, correct, and trustworthy. You know, if there's incorrect information or misinformation or forbid disinformation, these are all types that to discourage people to then begin to follow and actually abide by what is being said. There's the last one, which again, before the last, familiarity with the preferred definition of reality, social norms, values, and beliefs. You know, We have a melting pot of people and cultures, and we need to be sensitive to that in terms of how we bring information across, even during pandemics. And then lastly, the perceived trustworthiness. Most of the factors all contribute to a greater or lesser extent to whether we can actually trust the information, trust the organization, and so on. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that a new social compact needs to really come out of these three channels of communications. From a government communications point of view, I'd like to say that we cannot wait for a crisis to work with media and to foster relationships. That needs to be an ongoing phenomenon to have built good relations and make that the norm. Through one of the ways is consistent press releases, consistent press conferences. We've seen it in many other countries where it's not just about topical issues, but that there needs to be a continuous flow of government communication to mainstream media as well as community media. Your traditional media need to continue with high quality investigative journalism, but at the same time, whilst we embrace that, it mustn't be seen to be confrontational. We have seen too many times during this pandemic, Desiree, that mainstream media only wants to concentrate on sensational stories. Of course, no one is saying you shouldn't report on corruption. That must be done. But I'm sure you'll all agree that it went way beyond that in terms of wanting to make sure that we throw the whole process into the balance because we are only concentrating on the sensational. One other example I should mention is around the ban on cigarettes. There was a faux pas in terms of the communication thereof between the minister and the president, and for weeks that was the main story, let alone the fact that people were fighting for their lives and going hungry and so on. And then, of course, from a social media point of view, it is the improved regulation that I'm saying is needed, because people.
Dr. Van Heerden.
Yeah.
I'm terribly sorry to come in here, but as a news person, I'm tempted to invite you to engage further on this, but I'm afraid the time allocation I had asked all our participants to allow us for is really come to an end. Can I ask the administrators that we distribute your presentation, and I promise I will use other avenues to take this conversation further.
Okay.
But thank you very much to all our participants today. Fatima Wan, Eba Kalondo, Dr. Oscar Van Heerden, fantastic presentation, Guguntuli. Thank you so much to Jessica Ilanga, gave an amazing presentation. At this point, I'm going to ask Tasneem Karim to give us the results of the poll. Tasneem?
Afternoon, colleagues. Thank you very much. I think Mdeni is supposed to project it. It was an online poll conducted while the webinar was going on, and the results are quite interesting and useful. And I think there we go. I hope everybody can see it. So I think possibly the results are this way because of some of the positive contributions that we received from some of the participants, and showing us the best case scenarios in difficult circumstances of how you can use communication in an integrated way. But certainly 80% of the participants agree that the media plays an important role in educating the public. And we've seen those examples in South Africa, in the DRC, and in other places as well. This question here is not was not limited to one answer. So of this grouping, 60% also agree that that the media provided information that helped me to better understand and adhere to the lockdown regulations, and that's also a positive result. And it seems to be that there's a 16% who is here amongst us who feel that the media has exaggerated the extent of the coronavirus outbreak, and possibly the same 16% also think that the media is not providing enough accurate and reliable information to the public. And certainly, I'm sure we can all agree that we as governments, as Dr. van Heerden has shown, we as governments could do better to make sure that we assist the media to continue providing more accurate and reliable information to the public. But by far, I think the majority have shown that they think the media is an important partner, and we should continue working with the media to provide information timeously and accurately. Let's go on to the next one. While Mdeni is putting it on, I will just give you a sense that the question was, would you say the media is currently doing well in informing African citizens about the COVID-19 pandemic as compared to previous pandemic or outbreaks such as Ebola in Africa? And 80% of the participants agree that the media is currently doing well compared to previously. I think this can also be attributed to the experience that we've already gained, as Ms. Kalondo was speaking about, and I think we can only get better from here. So we need to use the experience that we've gained to continue improving the relationship and making sure that the media remain our good partners. So if we go to the next question, please, Mdeni. And I think he's trying to load it, and while he's loading it, I can just quickly tell you. The question was specifically about the South African government, because we are very much utilizing the platform that you've all kindly agreed to join us on to pick on your expertise and your knowledge, and thank you very much for that. And the question was, do you think the South African government is doing well in combating fake news about COVID-19? And 60% say, yes, we are, although 24% say, no, we're not, and the rest do not know. And I think this speaks to some of the issues that Ms. Ilonga and Gugu, as well as Fatima Wan, spoke to in your presentations, that it's something we have to be vigilant of all the time and combat fake news very, very quickly. And I think we can only do better from here. Furthermore, when we are asking participants which platform, and this is across the continent, not just South Africa, but across the continent, which of the following media platforms are favored, it seems that radio and TV are both favored at 68% each, followed by 52% on newspapers and just 4% for magazines, which might explain the reason why so many magazines have been closing recently. And 44% feel that the internet is more reliable, whereas 28% believe that social media is the best place for getting information. And I think that gives us a very good thumbs up to the media sector, radio, TV and print, as the primary carriers of news. Also, another question that we asked, using your expertise about your opinions on South Africa, It's about transparency. And here we ask the question, the government of South Africa has been open and transparent about the extent of the coronavirus outbreak, and 68% say yes, while 8% say no. They don't feel that the government has been transparent enough. Chairperson, that's the end of the poll. I had also prepared a presentation, which I think we don't have time for, but maybe if I could just quickly share what the purpose of it was, so that I think the administrators might choose to share it with the participants here, because I know we don't have time. But let me quickly tell you that one of the things that we've started to do, and it's been a painful process, not just through this campaign, but through previous ones as well, is that we have started developing a set of standards, norms and standards for communication in general, but as well during a crisis, and the pandemic is considered a crisis. And then we've now started monitoring whether our departments in our government have been applying the set of norms and standards.
Yeah.
And so we've got a report that actually shows how many